The city exhaled a cold, metallic breath, slicking the asphalt with a persistent drizzle that blurred the streetlights into hazy, weeping stars. For Clara, the rain was just another layer of exhaustion. It seeped into the worn soles of her nursing shoes, a damp reminder of the 16-hour shift that had just ended, a marathon of beeping machines, strained voices, and the quiet, sterile scent of antiseptic that clung to her clothes like a second skin. Her small apartment, with its overdue bills tucked neatly under a ceramic mug, felt a world away. She pulled the thin fabric of her coat tighter, a meager defense against the biting October wind that funneled between the towering, indifferent buildings. She walked with her head down, a habit born of fatigue and the desire to be invisible, just one more shadow moving through the wet, glistening night. But then, a sound, a small, weak whimper, almost carried away by the wind. It was so faint, so out of place in the urban cacophony of distant sirens and rumbling traffic, that she almost dismissed it. Yet, something in her, the caregiver's instinct that hummed beneath the surface of her weariness, made her stop. She listened again, tilting her head, her blonde ponytail heavy with rainwater. There it was, a thread of distress in the vast tapestry of the city's noise. It led her away from the main sidewalk, toward a narrow alley that separated a closed bookstore from a high-end restaurant, its warm, golden light a stark contrast to the oppressive gloom. Behind a large, green dumpster, she saw him. A little boy, no older than 5 or 6, was curled into a tight ball, his small body trembling violently. He was wearing an expensive-looking coat, but it was soaked through, and his face, pale and cherubic, was flushed with a feverish heat she could feel even from a few feet away. His lips were tinged with blue. All the exhaustion evaporated from Clara's limbs, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. She knelt, her knees sinking into the grimy puddle on the ground. "Hey there," she said, her voice soft and steady, the same tone she used to soothe frightened patients in the emergency room. "It's okay. I'm here to help." The boy's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. He tried to speak, but only another weak whimper escaped. She placed a hand on his forehead. It was burning. Hypothermia and a severe fever. A dangerous combination. She looked around frantically. The street was deserted. The restaurant was a world of clinking glasses and muted laughter, oblivious to the small life flickering just feet away. She couldn't wait. Shrugging off her own coat, the only warm thing she owned, she wrapped it tightly around the shivering child, cocooning him in its worn but dry embrace. She scooped him into her arms. He was terrifyingly light. "It's all right," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. "I've got you." She ran back, toward the main street, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't have money for a cab, so she did the only thing she could. She ran the 6 blocks back to the hospital, the small, feverish weight in her arms giving her a strength she didn't know she possessed. The emergency room doors hissed open, and she was back in the world she had just left, but this time as a desperate advocate, not an employee. "I need help," she called out, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos. "Child with a high fever, probable hypothermia." Instantly, her colleagues swarmed, their professional calm taking over. The small boy was whisked away on a gurney, a team of nurses and doctors descending upon him. Clara stood by, dripping, shivering in her thin scrubs, feeling suddenly useless. She gave his vitals, described where she'd found him, her voice clinical and precise despite the tremor in her hands. As they worked on the child, a nurse found a small, embroidered tag inside the boy's designer jacket. It had a name, Leo, and a phone number designated Father. The call was made. Less than 20 minutes later, the doors to the emergency room burst open with a force that seemed to suck the air out of the room. A man stood there, framed by the doorway like a storm cloud. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than her car, and his face was a mask of cold fury and terror. His dark hair was perfectly styled, but his eyes, a startlingly intense shade of gray, were wild. This was a man accustomed to being in control, and the universe had just reminded him, brutally, that he was not. "Where is he? Where is my son?" His voice was a low growl that commanded the attention of the entire room. A doctor intercepted him, but the man's gaze swept past, landing on the small bed where his son lay, now hooked up to an 4 drip. Then his eyes found Clara, still standing nearby, a wet, shivering, and entirely insignificant-looking figure. He stared at her, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. In his world, nothing happened by chance, and people always wanted something. He strode toward her, his expensive leather shoes silent on the linoleum floor. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice devoid of warmth. Before Clara could answer, Leo stirred. His eyes opened, and his small hand reached out, not for the powerful man who was his father, but for the quiet woman in the worn scrubs. "Don't go," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The billionaire, Alistair Blackstone, froze, his gaze fixed on his son's small hand clinging desperately to Clara's. For the first time that night, his mask of controlled power cracked, revealing the raw, terrified father beneath. The sterile air of the private hospital room hummed with the quiet efficiency of expensive machines. Leo slept, his breathing still shallow but steadier now, his fever receding under the influence of antibiotics. Pneumonia, the doctors had confirmed, exacerbated by the cold. Alistair Blackstone had not left the plush chair in the corner of the room, a silent sentinel watching the slow rise and fall of his son's chest. He had dismissed his security detail, canceled 3 international conference calls, and postponed a multi-million-dollar acquisition, all with a series of curt, whispered commands into his phone. His world, usually a meticulously orchestrated symphony of commerce and power, had shrunk to the 4 walls of this room, to the fragile heartbeat of his only child. And in this shrunken world, there was an anomaly he could not process: the nurse. Clara. She hadn't left either. After the initial chaos in the ER, she had clocked back in, officially, claiming she was needed. The charge nurse, seeing the undeniable bond between her and the sick child, had quietly agreed. So she stayed, monitoring Leo's vitals, adjusting his blankets, and whispering soothing words whenever he grew restless. Alistair watched her, his mind, trained to analyze assets and liabilities, trying to categorize her. She moved with a quiet competence, a grace born of purpose, not of privilege. He noted her worn sneakers, the faint fraying at the cuffs of her scrubs, the deep, settled weariness in her eyes that even her professional resolve couldn't completely hide. She was, by all his metrics, insignificant. Yet, his son, who had been raised by a series of highly paid, agency-certified nannies, clung to this stranger as if she were a lifeline. When the doctor came in to give an update, Alistair rose, his imposing height filling the room. He listened intently, absorbing the medical jargon with sharp, incisive questions. Once the doctor left, he turned his attention back to Clara. The time for accounting had come. He pulled a sleek, leather checkbook and a gold pen from his jacket pocket. "I want to thank you for what you did," he said, his tone formal, transactional. He scribbled a figure on the check, a number with enough zeros to solve all the problems he assumed a woman like her must have. He tore it from the book and held it out to her. "For your trouble." Clara looked from the check in his hand to his guarded, unreadable face. There was no gratitude in his eyes, only the cold finality of a debt being settled. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. She gently shook her head, not even glancing at the amount. "I don't want your money, Mr. Blackstone," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm a nurse. It's my job to help people. Your son was sick and alone. I did what anyone should have done." Alistair's hand remained suspended in the air. He blinked slowly, as if the words she spoke were in a foreign language he couldn't comprehend. Refused? No one refused his money. Money was the universal solvent, the answer to every problem, the balm for every wound. It was the foundation upon which his entire empire, his entire life, was built. To see it dismissed so easily, so genuinely, was like watching gravity fail. "Everyone has a price," he stated, a hint of his usual cynicism creeping back into his voice. It was a reflex, a defense against the unfamiliar feeling of being misjudged. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Clara replied, her gaze unwavering. "Some things, some people, aren't for sale." She turned her attention back to Leo, dipping a cloth in a bowl of cool water and gently dabbing his forehead. The simple, tender gesture held a power that Alistair's checkbook could never match. It was an act of pure, uncompensated kindness. He slowly retracted his hand, folding the check and tucking it back into his pocket, the crisp paper feeling suddenly flimsy and useless. He had built walls around his heart after his wife's death, fortified them with wealth and work, creating an impenetrable fortress of solitude. He solved problems with leverage and capital, not with gentleness and empathy. This woman, with her quiet dignity and worn-out shoes, had just walked through his defenses without even trying. He found himself asking, his voice softer than he intended, "How did you know he was so sick?" Clara didn't look up from her task. His lips were blue. His skin was cold, but his forehead was burning. The shivering was severe. It's called cyanosis. It means he wasn't getting enough oxygen. She explained the symptoms clinically, but her voice was laced with a deep, resonant empathy. He was just a patient to her, and yet, he was everything. Alistair felt a strange, unsettling pang in his chest. It was respect. He, a titan of industry who commanded the respect of world leaders, felt a profound sense of esteem for this humble city nurse. He sank back into his chair, the silence in the room no longer empty, but filled with the weight of his own miscalculations. He watched her for the rest of the night, a silent, complex equation reconfiguring itself in his mind. The anomaly had a name, and it was Clara. And for the first time in a very long time, Alistair Blackstone had no idea what to do next. Leo was discharged 2 days later, a pale but recovering shadow of his usual energetic self. The diagnosis of pneumonia meant he needed constant, careful monitoring at home, a quiet environment, and specialized care. Alistair, ever the problem solver, had arranged for the best. A team of private nurses from the city's most exclusive agency was hired. They were crisp, efficient, and had impeccable credentials. They were also strangers. The Blackstone Mansion, a sprawling testament to modernist architecture, was more museum than home. Its vast, white walls were adorned with expensive, abstract art. Its floors were polished marble that echoed every footstep, and its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a meticulously manicured garden that no one ever used. It was a beautiful, sterile cage. Leo hated it. He refused his medicine from the agency nurse, a stern woman with a starched white uniform. He pushed away the perfectly prepared meals from the household chef. He lay in his enormous bed in his cavernous room, silent and sullen, his only request a whispered, repeated plea for Clara. Alistair, watching his son's decline from the doorway, felt a familiar surge of helpless frustration. He had provided the best care money could buy, yet his son was miserable. The agency nurse reported that Leo's temperature was beginning to creep up again, likely due to stress and his refusal to cooperate. It was then that Alistair made a decision that defied all his logic and protocol. He was going to find the one thing his money hadn't been able to secure: genuine, compassionate care. He got Clara's address from the hospital's employee records, a minor transgression of privacy that his name and a hefty donation to the pediatric wing made possible. The drive to her neighborhood was a journey into another world. The sleek, black sedan, silent as a shark, glided past the gleaming skyscrapers of his financial district and into a part of the city characterized by brick tenements, bustling corner bodegas, and children playing on the sidewalks. Her building was old, with a certain weary charm, its fire escapes zigzagging across the facade. He found her apartment on the 4th floor. There was no elevator. He took the stairs, his handmade Italian shoes clicking on the worn linoleum. He knocked, and after a moment, the door opened. Clara stood there, looking startled. She was wearing faded jeans and a simple, soft-looking sweater. Her hair was down, falling in gentle waves around her shoulders. Behind her, he could see her apartment. It was tiny, perhaps smaller than his walk-in closet, but it was filled with an astonishing amount of warmth. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow. A collection of mismatched mugs sat on an open shelf. A stack of well-read books teetered on a small table, and a handmade quilt was draped over the back of a comfortable-looking armchair. The air smelled of cinnamon and old paper. It was a home. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, her voice filled with surprise. "Is Leo okay?" Her first thought was for his son. The realization struck him with unexpected force. "He's recovering. But he's not happy," Alistair admitted, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He was not a man who admitted to problems he couldn't personally solve. "He misses you. He's been asking for you." Clara's expression softened with concern. She looked past him, into the hallway. as if expecting to see the little boy standing there. "I have a proposition for you," Alistair said, getting straight to the point. Business was a language he understood. "I want to hire you to be Leo's private nurse until he is fully recovered. The salary is negotiable. Name your price." He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the familiar flicker of pride. She was going to refuse. He could see it coming. He quickly changed tactics, letting a rare note of vulnerability enter his voice. "Please," he said, the word feeling heavy and significant. "He needs you. I need you to help him." Clara looked at this powerful man, who seemed so out of place in her small, humble world, and saw not a billionaire CEO, but a desperate father. Her heart, the boundless, empathetic heart of a caregiver, went out to him. Still, she had to be sure. "This isn't charity, Mr. Blackstone," she said quietly. "I would expect to be treated as a professional, not a project." "Of course," he said immediately. "And the salary," she continued, "would be the standard rate for a private nurse. Not a penny more. I won't accept anything else." She was setting the terms. To him, it was unheard of, and yet, he found himself nodding in agreement. "Whatever you say." She gave a small, decisive nod. "Okay, Mr. Blackstone. For Leo, I'll do it." As she packed a small, worn suitcase with her simple belongings, Alistair stood by the window of her tiny apartment, looking down at his gleaming, empty car waiting on the street below. He was bringing her into his world of wealth and isolation, but he had a sudden, jarring feeling that it was he who was being rescued, not her. The collision of their worlds was about to begin, and he was completely unprepared for the impact. Clara's arrival at the Blackstone mansion was less an arrival and more a quiet infiltration of warmth into a sterile void. The moment she walked through the towering front doors, Leo, who had been listlessly watching from the top of the grand, sweeping staircase, let out a cry of pure joy. "Clara!" He scrambled down the cold marble steps as fast as his recovering lungs would allow and threw himself into her arms. Clara sank to her knees, ignoring the disapproving stare of the household manager, and hugged him tightly, burying her face in his soft hair. "I missed you, sweet boy," she whispered. Alistair watched the scene from his study, a glass of untouched whiskey on his massive oak desk. He saw the immediate change in his son, the way the light returned to his eyes, the way his small body relaxed in her embrace. It was a transformation no amount of money or medical expertise had been able to achieve. He had hired a nurse, but he had brought home a miracle. In the days that followed, Clara systematically dismantled the cold, rigid formality of the household. She convinced the chef to let her and Leo bake cookies in the state-of-the-art kitchen, leaving a dusting of flour on the pristine chrome surfaces that the cleaning staff frantically tried to erase. The scent of warm chocolate chip cookies, a scent that had never before graced the mansion's filtered air, wafted through the long, silent hallways. She turned Leo's cavernous bedroom, once a showcase of designer children's furniture, into a cozy den, building a fort out of expensive silk sheets and reading him stories with animated voices that echoed softly in the quiet house. She discovered the overgrown, forgotten garden and took Leo outside for small doses of fresh air, her simple joy in a blooming rose or a scurrying ladybug reawakening the small boy's sense of wonder. Alistair found himself drawn to the quiet revolution happening within his own home. He began to leave his office earlier, the lure of international markets and stock tickers fading in comparison to the sound of Leo's laughter. He would stand in doorways, unseen, and watch them. He watched as Clara patiently taught Leo how to draw a lopsided, smiling sun, her hand guiding his. He watched as she managed to coax Leo into taking his medicine by pretending the spoon was an airplane. Each gentle act was a quiet indictment of his own detached parenting. One evening, he found her in the library after Leo had fallen asleep. It was a vast, two-story room with thousands of leather-bound books that had never been read. She was standing by a window, looking out at the city lights twinkling below. "He's doing much better," Alistair said, his voice startling her. "His fever is gone. The doctor is very pleased. He just needed to feel safe," Clara said, turning to face him. Her face was illuminated by the soft moonlight, and in that moment, she looked ethereal, out of place amongst the dark wood and gilded spines of his unread books. "A house isn't always a home, Mr. Blackstone." "Alistair," he corrected her, the name feeling unfamiliar in this context. Please, call me Alistair. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, a rare thing in Alistair's life, which was usually filled with noise and demands. Why do you do it? He asked, genuinely curious. Nursing. It's a difficult, often thankless job. Clara smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that seemed to warm the cavernous room. I lost my parents when I was young, she said softly, her voice holding a distant echo of pain. I remember the nurse who sat with me. She didn't say much, but she held my hand. She made me feel seen. I guess I've spent my life trying to be that person for someone else. Her vulnerability was a disarming force. Alistair felt a chink in his own armor widen. I lost my wife, he found himself saying, the words coming out before he could stop them. 3 years ago. The house has been quiet ever since. It was the most personal thing he had shared with anyone in years. He was sharing it with his son's nurse, a woman he barely knew, yet somehow felt he had known forever. He saw a flicker of understanding, of shared grief, in her expressive blue eyes. She didn't offer empty platitudes or condolences. She just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of his pain. In that quiet moment of shared history, something shifted between them. He was no longer just her employer, and she was no longer just an employee. They were two lonely people, brought together by a small, sick child, standing in a silent library, and, for the first time, truly seeing each other. The slow-burn romance, unexpected and terrifyingly real, had begun to smolder in the cold, empty halls of the Blackstone mansion. The tentative peace that had settled over the Blackstone mansion was a fragile, beautiful thing, like a soap bubble shimmering in the sun. Alistair and Clara began to exist in a quiet orbit around each other, their days defined by Leo's recovery and their nights by long, whispered conversations after the boy was asleep. They spoke of everything and nothing, of her dream to one day work in a clinic for underprivileged families, of his forgotten passion for sailing. They were two disparate worlds slowly, cautiously, beginning to merge. But the bubble was always destined to pop. The catalyst for its destruction arrived in the form of a vintage, chauffeur-driven Bentley and the formidable woman who emerged from it, Victoria Blackstone, Alistair's mother. Victoria was a woman carved from ice and old money. She moved with the regal certainty of someone who had never been told no, her life a carefully curated collection of charity galas, board meetings, and social conquests. She viewed the world through a prism of lineage and net worth, and her love for her son was inextricably linked to her ambitions for the Blackstone dynasty. She arrived unannounced, a week before the annual Blackstone Foundation Gala, an event she personally orchestrated as the pinnacle of the city's social calendar. She swept into the mansion, her hawk-like eyes immediately taking in the changes. The stray crayon marks on a hallway table, the scent of something freshly baked, the sound of laughter drifting from the garden. It was all evidence of a contamination of her pristine world. Her gaze fell upon Clara, who was helping Leo plant a small flower, her hands covered in dirt, a smudge of soil on her cheek. Victoria's lips thinned into a razor-sharp line of disapproval. Alistair, she said, her voice dripping with chilly condescension as her son came to greet her. You failed to mention the new help. Over the next few days, Victoria launched a campaign of subtle psychological warfare. She referred to Clara exclusively as the nurse. She would issue orders to her as if she were a common maid, asking her to fetch tea or clear away dishes. During a planning meeting for the gala, held in the mansion's formal dining room, Victoria loudly discussed the guest list, making pointed remarks about the importance of maintaining standards and associating with the right sort of people, all while staring directly at Clara, who was quietly trying to get Leo to eat his lunch at the far end of the table. Alistair, caught up in the stress of the impending gala and long accustomed to his mother's imperious nature, was initially blind to the full extent of her cruelty. He saw her behavior as her usual brand of difficult snobbery, not as a targeted attack. The conflict came to a head on the night of the gala. The mansion was transformed, filled with the city's elite, a glittering sea of diamonds and designer gowns. Clara, knowing it was not her place, had planned to stay upstairs with Leo. But Leo, excited by the music, had insisted on seeing the decorations. Clara had brought him down a back staircase just for a peek when Victoria cornered them in a secluded alcove, her face a mask of cold fury. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Parading the boy in front of our guests? You are an employee. You are to remain out of sight." "He just wanted to see the lights," Clara said softly, her arm protectively around Leo's shoulders. "I don't care what he wants," Victoria snapped. "I care about appearances. And the appearance of a common nurse ingratiating herself with my family is not one I will tolerate. I see what you're doing. I've seen it 1,000 times. You think because my son has shown you a moment of weakness, you can trap him. But you need to understand your place. You will never be one of us. You are nothing." The words were like shards of glass, each one sharp and deliberately cruel. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. From the corner of the hallway, a flash went off. A paparazzo, likely tipped off by one of Victoria's social rivals, had captured the entire, ugly confrontation. The powerful matriarch, the tearful nurse, the frightened child. The perfect ingredients for a scandal. Clara, seeing the flash, knew in that instant that her quiet, fragile world had just been shattered. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was a liability. The bubble had popped, and all that was left was the cold, hard reality of their two worlds, forever and irrevocably separate. The morning after the gala, the storm broke. The photograph was plastered across the front page of the city's most notorious gossip tabloid, displayed in every newsstand and on every screen. The image was devastating. Victoria Blackstone, poised and venomous. Clara, heartbroken and vulnerable. And little Leo, looking up at her with wide, frightened eyes. The headline was even worse, printed in bold, accusatory letters. "Billionaire's nurse or gold-digging nanny. Blackstone matriarch clashes with son's scheming caregiver." The words twisted the knife of Victoria's accusations deep into Clara's heart. Scheming. Gold-digging. They painted her kindness as a tactic, her love for Leo as a strategy. She felt a wave of nausea as she looked at it on the tablet the household manager had left on the kitchen counter. Suddenly, all the small kindnesses from Alistair, all their quiet conversations, were cast in a new, sordid light. She saw herself through the world's eyes, through Victoria's eyes, a poor, nobody nurse who had gotten too close to a rich, powerful man. She was a scandal, a complication, a burden to the man she was realizing she had fallen in love with, and a source of public humiliation for the little boy she adored. The decision, though excruciating, was immediate and absolute. She could not be the cause of this. Her presence, which had once brought warmth into this house, now brought only shame and controversy. She had to leave. Quietly, she went to her room, the guest suite that had started to feel like a sanctuary. It was filled with small treasures from her time there. A lopsided clay bird Leo had made for her, a book of poetry Alistair had left for her after one of their late-night talks. Looking at them now brought a fresh wave of pain. She packed her single, worn suitcase, the same one she had arrived with. Her simple clothes seemed to mock the opulence of the room. She belonged back in her tiny, fourth-floor apartment, in a world where her actions weren't scrutinized and her heart wasn't front-page news. On a piece of simple stationery she found in the desk, she wrote a short, tear-stained letter. Her hand trembled as she formed the words. "Alistair, I can't be the reason your family is dragged through the mud. You and Leo deserve a life free from this kind of ugliness. Thank you for your kindness, for letting me be a part of Leo's life. It was a gift. Please tell him I am sorry. Clara." She left the note on her perfectly made bed. She looked at the final paycheck the household manager had left for her, a sum that could have paid her rent for a year. She pushed it away. She wouldn't take another penny. She had come here for Leo, not for the money, and she would leave the same way. With her heart full of love and her pockets empty, she slipped out of the mansion like a ghost, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. She didn't look back. The silence she left behind was heavier, more profound than the silence that had existed before her arrival. It was a silence now filled with her absence. Alistair woke up feeling a sense of unease. The house was too quiet. The usual sounds of Leo's early morning chatter were missing. He went to his son's room and found him sitting up in bed, his eyes red-rimmed. "Daddy," Leo whispered, his voice trembling. "I can't find Clara." A cold dread washed over Alistair. He went to her room. The door was ajar. The bed was made with military precision. The small, personal touches were gone. And on the pillow sat the white envelope. He read the letter, his heart sinking with every word. He saw the tabloid on the kitchen counter and understood everything. The cruelty of his mother, the invasiveness of the media, the impossible position she had been put in. He crumpled the newspaper in his fist, rage and regret warring within him. He ran out of the house, shouting her name into the crisp morning air, but he was met only with the mocking chirp of birds in the perfectly trimmed hedges. He went back inside to find Leo sobbing, clutching the little clay bird Clara had left behind. The mansion, which had so recently begun to feel like a home, reverted in an instant to what it had always been, a vast, cold, and exquisitely lonely cage. And Alistair Blackstone, the man who had everything, realized he had just lost the only thing that truly mattered. The loss of Clara plunged the Blackstone mansion into a state of emotional permafrost. The silence that returned was not the peaceful quiet of before, but a hollow, aching void. Leo retreated into himself, a small, inconsolable ghost haunting the vast hallways, clutching the clay bird she had left behind as if it were a sacred relic. He barely ate, and the light in his eyes had been extinguished. Alistair was consumed by a maelstrom of fury and self-recrimination. He saw now, with blinding clarity, how he had failed her. He had been so absorbed in his own world, so accustomed to his mother's abrasive personality, that he had stood by and allowed her to be wounded, to be driven away. The tabloid story was merely the weapon. The attack had happened under his own roof. His first act was a confrontation. He found his mother, Victoria, in the drawing room, calmly sipping tea and reviewing invitations as if nothing had happened. He placed the crumpled tabloid on the table in front of her. "This," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "is your doing." Victoria glanced at the paper with disdain. "I did what was necessary to protect this family from a vulgar little opportunist. You should be thanking me." "Thanking you." Alistair's voice rose, shaking with a rage she had not seen since he was a rebellious teenager. "You drove away the first decent, genuinely kind person to walk through that door in years. You broke my son's heart. You broke my heart." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and undeniable. "She brought this house back to life. She brought me back to life. And you couldn't stand it because she wasn't from our world. Because her value can't be measured in stock portfolios or social connections." Victoria looked at him, for the first time, with a flicker of fear. The son she had so carefully molded was gone, replaced by this stranger filled with passion and conviction. "Her world," Alistair continued, his voice dropping to an intense whisper, "is better than ours, Mother. It's real. Yours is a hollow performance. And I am done playing my part. She is the woman I love, and I am going to get her back." He left his mother stunned and silent amidst her porcelain teacups and social calendars. The declaration had solidified his resolve. This was no longer just about fixing a problem. It was about fighting for his future. He marshaled all the resources of his empire, but not for a hostile takeover or a corporate merger. This was a mission of the heart. He hired the best private investigators, not to dig up dirt, but to find one good woman who had vanished. "Find her," he instructed his head of security. "But be gentle. No intimidation. I don't want her to feel hunted. I just need to know where she is." The first few days were fruitless. She wasn't at her apartment, which had a new "for rent" sign in the window. She hadn't returned to her old job at the city hospital. Her resignation had been quiet and immediate. She had paid her final bills in cash and disappeared, covering her tracks with the quiet efficiency of someone who was used to having little and leaving less. Alistair felt a growing panic. What if she was gone for good? What if she never wanted to be found? The thought was a physical pain, a tightening in his chest that made it hard to breathe. Then, a small breakthrough came. An investigator, interviewing Clara's former colleagues, spoke to a quiet admitting clerk who remembered a conversation. Clara had once mentioned her dream, a distant, someday fantasy. She had talked about a small, underfunded free clinic in a rural town called Havenwood, a few hours upstate. She'd said that was where real nursing happened, where people were cared for without price tags. It was a long shot, a breadcrumb of a memory, but it was all Alistair had. He looked up Havenwood. It was a small, forgotten town, struggling economically. The clinic, just as the clerk had said, was its only healthcare provider and was constantly on the brink of financial collapse, running on donations and the sheer willpower of its staff. Alistair looked at the grainy photo of the small, unassuming building on his computer screen. A plan began to form in his mind, a grand gesture that was not about him, but about her. He wouldn't just show up on her doorstep and beg. He had to prove he had changed. He had to show her that he had finally learned her language, the language of selfless care. He wouldn't just win her back. He would become a man worthy of her. Alistair Blackstone, a man whose every move was usually shrouded in corporate secrecy, called a press conference. The media world buzzed with speculation. The consensus was that he would finally address the Nannygate scandal, either with a terse denial, a threat of lawsuits, or, most likely, a carefully worded statement crafted by a team of PR experts. They expected damage control. They were not prepared for what they got. Alistair walked to the podium in the Blackstone Towers auditorium, not with his usual air of detached authority, but with a palpable, nervous energy. He looked out at the sea of reporters and flashing cameras, took a deep breath, and began to speak, his voice clear and steady. "Good morning. I've asked you here today not to discuss the recent, regrettable stories about my private life," he started, immediately scuttling their expectations. "Gossip is a fleeting and empty thing. I am here to talk about something real, something of actual value." A hush fell over the room. For a long time, he continued, his gaze distant, as if seeing something beyond the walls of the room. "I lived my life believing that wealth was the ultimate measure of a man. I built an empire. I acquired assets. I filled my life with things. But my house was not a home. It was cold and silent. I was successful, but I was not happy. I had forgotten what it meant to truly live." The reporters scribbled furiously, their faces a mixture of confusion and intrigue. This was not the Alistair Blackstone they knew. "Recently," he said, a genuine warmth infusing his voice, "I had the great privilege of meeting someone who reminded me of what true wealth is. It is not found in bank accounts or stock tickers. True wealth is kindness. It is integrity. It is the courage to care for others without asking for anything in return. It is the quiet, tireless work of people who dedicate their lives to healing and helping. People like nurses, caregivers, and volunteers, who are the true titans of our society." He never mentioned Clara's name. He didn't have to. For anyone who had seen the tabloid photo, the dedication was unmistakable. "This person showed me that my priorities were wrong. And so, I am here today to announce a change. Effective immediately, I am restructuring my company's mission. We are launching the Blackstone Family Foundation, a new charitable organization with an initial endowment of $500 million. Gasps rippled through the auditorium. "The foundation's sole purpose will be to support and empower grassroots healthcare initiatives in underserved communities. We will fund clinics, provide scholarships for nursing students, and ensure that those who spend their lives caring for others are themselves cared for." He paused, letting the weight of his announcement settle. "And the Foundation's first official act," he declared, his voice ringing with purpose, "will be to provide a permanent, irrevocable grant to a small but vital institution. A free clinic in a town called Havenwood, which has been struggling to keep its doors open. We will ensure that the Havenwood Community Clinic not only survives but thrives, so it can continue its incredible work for generations to come." He looked directly into the main television camera, his gray eyes intense and sincere. He wasn't speaking to the reporters anymore. He was speaking to an audience of one. "It is my hope," he concluded, "that this is the beginning of a new legacy for my family. One based not on what we have, but on what we give." He then turned and walked off the stage, leaving behind a room of stunned journalists and a public message of profound transformation. He had taken the ugliness of a public scandal and turned it into a monumental act of public good. It was his grand gesture, a testament not in words, but in deeds, a public declaration that he had finally understood the values she lived by. It was the ultimate love letter, written not on paper, but on the future of an entire community. The old television in the corner of the Havenwood Community Clinic staff room flickered, its antenna wrapped in aluminum foil. The local news was on, mostly covering town council meetings and county fairs. Clara was on her break, sipping lukewarm tea from a chipped mug, feeling a sense of weary satisfaction. The work here was hard, the resources scarce, but it was meaningful. She was healing people, not just their bodies, but their dignity. She was home. Suddenly, the local broadcast was interrupted by a national news flash. The face of Alistair Blackstone filled the screen. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. She stood up, her eyes wide, as she watched him at the podium. She listened, transfixed, as he spoke not of gossip, but of kindness, of integrity, of true wealth. Every word resonated deep within her soul, a perfect echo of her own beliefs. And then he said it. Havenwood Community Clinic. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The other nurses in the room, who had been half listening, all turned to stare at the screen, their expressions of disbelief mirroring her own. He was talking about them, about their small, struggling clinic. He was saving them. As he finished his speech, his eyes looking directly into the camera, Clara felt as though he were looking right at her, right into her heart. She knew. This breathtaking, impossibly grand gesture was for her. It was his way of saying he understood. Tears streamed down her face, not of sadness or regret, but of overwhelming, cathartic joy. He hadn't just found her, he had honored her. An hour later, as the clinic was buzzing with the incredible news, a simple, dark sedan pulled up outside. Not a limousine, not a chauffeured Bentley, just a car. Alistair got out. He wasn't wearing one of his power suits, but a simple pair of trousers and a dark sweater. He looked younger, less burdened. He walked toward the clinic, his eyes scanning the building until they found her, standing just outside the entrance, as if she had been waiting for him. The world seemed to fall away. It started to rain, a soft, gentle shower, washing the dust from the air. It felt like a cleansing, a new beginning. He stopped a few feet from her. "Hi," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "Hi," she whispered back. "That was quite an announcement," she said, a small, watery smile on her face. "I had to show you," he said, taking a step closer, "that I was listening, that I finally get it. The money, the power, it's all meaningless without you, Clara. My life is meaningless without you." He reached out and gently brushed a stray, rain-dampened strand of hair from her face. His touch sent a shiver through her. "I love you," he said, the words simple, direct, and filled with a universe of emotion. "I fell in love with you the moment you refused my check, and I've been falling ever since. I was a fool to let you go. Leo misses you. We are lost without you." Tears welled in her eyes again. "I love you too, Alistair," she confessed, the words she had held back for so long finally tumbling out. "I was just so scared. I didn't want to ruin your life." "You didn't ruin it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved it. You saved me." And then, right there, in the soft rain, on the cracked pavement in front of the small clinic he had just saved for her, Alistair Blackstone dropped to one knee. He didn't have a ring. He hadn't planned this part. It was pure, beautiful impulse. He just took her hand in his. "Clara, you are the kindest, strongest, most incredible person I have ever known. You taught me how to be a father again, how to be a man. You taught me how to live. I don't want to spend another day without you. Marry me. Build a life with me. Build a home with me." Through her tears, she was laughing, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Alistair. 1,000 times, yes." He rose and pulled her into his arms, and as they kissed, the rain began to subside. The clouds parted, and a single, brilliant ray of sunshine broke through, illuminating the two of them, a promise of the bright, beautiful future that lay ahead. 1 year later, the sun shone brightly on a day brimming with hope and celebration. The newly christened Leo and Clara Blackstone Children's Health Center stood as a gleaming testament to a promise fulfilled. What was once the small, struggling Havenwood Clinic was now a state-of-the-art facility, its welcoming doors open to every family, regardless of their ability to pay. Clara, no longer just a nurse but the co-chair of the Blackstone Family Foundation, stood beside Alistair, cutting a large blue ribbon to the sound of applause from the grateful community. She wore a simple but elegant dress, and her face glowed with a quiet, confident joy. She wasn't just a billionaire's wife. She was a partner, a leader, a force for good in her own right. Alistair looked at her, his eyes filled with an adoration that was plain for all to see. The hard, guarded edges of the wounded titan had melted away, replaced by the warmth and contentment of a man who had found his purpose. He held her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles, a simple, constant gesture of connection. The Blackstone mansion had undergone an even more profound transformation. The cold, sterile museum had been reborn as a vibrant, noisy, and joyful home. Leo's colorful drawings were now framed and hung proudly on the walls, right next to the expensive abstract art. The echoing hallways were filled with the scent of baking bread and the sound of a small child's delighted shrieks. Even Victoria Blackstone had changed. Chastened by her son's ultimatum and won over by Clara's unshakable grace, she had slowly shed her snobbery. She now spent her afternoons not at society luncheons, but on the floor of the mansion's living room, building elaborate Lego castles with her grandson, a genuine, delighted smile gracing her face. She had discovered the simple, profound joy of being a grandmother. Later that afternoon, the grand celebrations faded into the quiet intimacy of family. Alistair, Clara, and Leo were not in a boardroom or a ballroom, but in a public park, sitting on a simple wooden bench, sharing a bag of popcorn. Leo, now 7 and bursting with health and happiness, chattered excitedly about his day, leaning against Clara as if he had been born to be there. Alistair wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Are you happy?" he whispered, his lips against her hair. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder and looked at her new family. The loving man beside her, the happy child nestled against her. She thought of the journey that had brought them here, the rainy night, the sterile hospital room, the collision of their two worlds. It had been a modern fairy tale, but one grounded in something more real than magic, the transformative power of kindness. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, her voice soft with emotion. "We built a good life, Alistair." He smiled, looking out at the sun setting over the city, a city that no longer felt cold and indifferent, but full of promise. He had started with everything and had nothing, while she had started with nothing but possessed the key to everything. Together, they had discovered the only truth that mattered, that the greatest wealth is a home filled with love, and the grandest legacy is a life built on kindness.